All right, I hope everybody had a chance to get some coffee, or we're going to have lunch soon, so. All right, so we'd like to get on to the next portion. Aliana Trison, who's the WJC Director of Public Relations for Israel and North America, will introduce two panelists, two journalists, Barak David of Haaretz and Herb Kainin of the Jerusalem Post, and she will do the moderating. So, Aliana.
So I think this is a very interesting chance to sort of turn the tables around and have the journalists being the ones who are speaking. This is Herb Kainin from the Jerusalem Post, to my far left. He's been the diplomatic correspondent since 2000, and he's been with the newspaper for 30 years. Essentially, his job is related to the Prime Minister and to the Foreign Minister. He also has a column called Light, and a book that recently came out that's based on these columns that's called French Fries in Pita, which is very, very Israeli. It's very much a pleasure to have you here. Along with her is Barak David, who is a former colleague of mine when I was working at Haaretz. He's a diplomatic correspondent. He's joined the newspaper in April of 2007, and he also covers the Prime Minister's office, the Foreign Ministry, the Ministry of Defense, and he's covered a number of different issues on American-Israeli relations, EU-Israeli relations, and the peace process. Also writes a lot about Iran. Before joining Haaretz, he was with Ma'ariv, and he spent a year covering the Palestinian Authority, and he was also a diplomatic correspondent. And I would say that both of these journalists are probably the most well-read journalists in Anglo newspapers. When people read newspapers in the United States or in Canada, the two names that they know and the way that they get their information about Israeli politics is from these two people. And it's very, very interesting to see how what happens in Israeli politics is filtered into the consciousness of American readers or Canadian readers. So this is a bit about what we want to hear from them today, to discuss in a nutshell, really in 5 minutes each, their concept of regional geopolitics and how their jobs affect perception of Israel abroad. So I'm going to start with her. We've got about 5 minutes. We'll do 5 minutes of each, and then we'll open the floor to discussion and questions.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me here. Look, what I want to try to do is kind of take it down a notch from the whole geopolitical thing and the whole regional thing, and just bring it down to kind of a personal level. Because I think one of the main things that is missing in understanding Israel is understanding the mentality, understanding the psyche of the people. And that's, your lawmakers, you know that that's extremely important, because what the people feel, I mean, policy doesn't only start from the top down, it also filters from the bottom up. And to understand Israel, you have to understand what the mentalities of the people, what the psyche of the people is. And Israel has gone through a fundamental change. I started the diplomatic beat in 2000, right before the start of the Intifada, after the breakdown of the Camp David peace talks, or the Camp David talks with Barak and Arafat. And the country fundamentally changed with the Second Intifada. And I think when historians look back in Israel, they will look back at the Second Intifada and see that as a transformative moment in Israeli history. Maybe not the Six-Day War, maybe not the Yom Kippur War, but it was a huge transformative moment in history, in the country's history. Right? The country today, in December of 2015, is fundamentally different than it was in September 2000 before the Intifada, and even more different than it was when Oslo started in 1993. And all you have to do to look at that is look at the political landscape and how that has changed so dramatically. 1992 elections, Rabin against Shamir, the two center left-wing Zionist parties, Labor and Meretz, they won 56 seats out of the 120-seat Knesset. That's a lot, right? That's almost a majority. In the last elections, and they did well, they won 29 seats. Right? There's been 6 elections since 2000. The right has won 1. The center has won. The right has won 5. The center has won 1, and the left hasn't won an election since 1999. So you have to ask yourself the question: what's happened? What, did the Israelis stop wanting peace? Did the Israelis stop wanting to have peace with the Palestinians? And I think the answer to that is what's happened is the country was simply mugged by reality. Right? Mugged by reality. To understand this country, you have to understand what personal insecurity people feel. And it's not theoretical, and it's not paranoia, it's real, right? You've got people in the South worrying that a Qassam could be flying through their living room into their bedroom. You've got people walking around the streets of Jerusalem looking around to make sure they don't get stabbed. And now you've got folks up north, kind of worried about what's going to happen in Lebanon. The personal insecurity is real, and that's a big change from 2000. And I'll just give you my own personal example. Right? I've been here for 35 years. The most difficult time that I ever felt here was in 2000, 2005, during the Intifada. And that's when the whole sense of security was flipped on its head, right? What used to be secure was no longer secure. The whole psychology of security was flipped on its head. In 2002, I was in Miluim. I was in reserves on the Golan Heights, right on the Syrian border. Right? I was there in March 2002, which was the absolute worst month of terrorism we ever had. 135 people killed in 1 month. Right? That's the month of the Leil Seder massacre in Netanya. Put that in proportion to what's going on today, and it's a completely different story. I was in a mutzav. I was in an outpost on the Golan Heights. Right? I was hunkered down in my bunker. Right? I had a flak jacket, a helmet, a rifle. I felt secure. I felt safe. I was worried about my 13-year-old daughter at the time, who had to take a bus from where I live in Malodamim to go to school in Jerusalem. And that's how the whole sense of security was switched, and that changed everything. And what happened there, right, you've got the same thing coming back at us now. This is triggering the same kind of emotional response. Again, just to give you a sense of where our heads are at, or where my head is at, I've got 4 kids. The one kid that I'm least concerned about right now is my son who's training in the Army, because he's not walking around the street. Now that stuff matters. That stuff has an impact, and to understand Israel, to understand everything we do, to understand the security fence, to understand the checkpoints, which look very difficult and are very difficult, to understand why the country votes in Netanyahu time after time after time, right? Why in March, when you had a huge disruption between Obama and Netanyahu, this country went to the polls, and knowing full well that this ain't going to help the relations with the U.S., they still voted in Netanyahu. You have to understand that whole security piece. So I'll just leave it at that. I'll turn it to Barak, and then we can take questions.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me here today. I thought of starting with something else, but what Herb said triggered me to take it to another direction. In the last, I'm covering the Prime Minister's office for since 2006, and since 2006, every year in March, I usually travel with the Prime Minister to Washington. I don't know how many of you are aware, but every year in March there's the annual AIPAC conference in Washington, the pro-Israeli lobby in the U.S. And every time there's, I think that in 2006, there were like 13,000 people. Last year there were 16,000 people. Every year there are more people. And they put them all in this big convention center in Washington. And you go in, and you go into the main hall, and there are like those huge video screens with those videos about all the bad things that are happening around Israel and the big threats. And you hear for the whole day, you hear about Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, nuclear, chemical weapons, delegitimization, BDS, boycotts, whatever. And you hear, congressman after congressman, senator after senator coming up on stage and, giving their analysis of how Israel is under threat, and, Israeli politicians coming on stage and telling the 15,000 people in the crowd how Israel is under threat of annihilation and extinction, and that, or the prime minister coming on stage saying that we are on the verge of a second Holocaust or whatever. And every time I go there, I go back with this, weird sensation that there's not a lot of what's going on in this convention center really reflects what the average Israeli, or the I don't know if he what he thinks, but what the average Israeli feels about his daily life, or what are the main issues that concerns him. I sometimes tell people in those conventions, because you go around, you mingle, you talk to people, and I'll tell you what I'm telling them every year, that Israel is a superpower. It's a regional superpower. It's a military superpower. It's an economic superpower. It's a diplomatic superpower. It's a country that has the strongest army in the region, more than all of its neighboring armies combined. It can annihilate every living organism in a radius of 1,500 kilometers. That's not bad, I would say. It has, even if there are some problems right now, it has quite good economy, especially if you compare it to other places in the world that some of you come from. And at the end of the day, when you look at our external threats, in my analysis, Israel is in its best situation in years. The Syrian army, Syrian army that for years was the biggest threat to Israel with its huge stockpile of chemical weapons, long-range missiles, something like 3,000 main battle tanks. I can go on and on and on and on. Syrian army is over. It's non-existent. Okay, there's no threat from the Syrian army anymore. The Iraqi army, okay, for years we were, scared of the Iraqi army. It's over. The Iranian nuclear program is in the freezer for at least a few years. I'm not saying that it's over, that it's gone, but it's in the freezer. Hezbollah is totally consumed with what's going on in Lebanon, in Syria, sorry. They're having their Vietnam War in Syria. They have 1,000 people killed in the last few years, which is more than all their casualties in 20 years in all of their wars against Israel. They haven't had so many people killed as they had in Syria for the last 2 years. So all in all, I think that the external security situation is the best Israel had in years. Which brings us to the internal situation, which is, in my opinion, a much bigger problem. And the internal situation, and I'll just finish here, the internal situation is combined from few issues. Social economic issues that I think this is the main issue that concerns the lives of the average Israelis. And even if it's not an issue that is the number one issue people vote about, you see that, let's say, in the last 5 years, the Israeli politicians are much more aware of those issues and the fact that they are an interest for the voters, for their constituents. Internal problems are the situation of the Israeli democracy, okay, and relations between different groups in society, which I think is in my opinion, the biggest issue right now. And the third issue, which I see it as an internal issue, is our ongoing conflict with the Palestinian and the almost 50-year-old occupation. And this is now, as it's been for years, this is an issue that is not going away. It's not going to go away. And it's another very big challenge that I feel is going towards the point of, which is I think is a good thing, because there's a crystallization of opinions on this, and I think that in the next year or two, and in the next election, this might be the biggest issue that people will say, either you're here or you're there, and it will be this point that decision will have to be made about what will happen with this issue and how it will influence the character of this country going forward.
I'd like to open the floor up to questions and a dialogue. So if anyone has anything that they'd like to say, or any questions. Okay, so I guess we can start with Betty.
Thank you. Just one point I'd like to make and then ask my question. The point is that I've been to APEC conferences for at least 25 years. In the past few years that I've been there, there have been massive sessions on Israel High Tech, Israel as a startup nation, Israel going into Haiti and making a hospital, and sessions on Mashav and all the contributions, huge sessions with Yossi Vardi, who we're going to see later today. So I think there is an equal emphasis on the positive that Israel does in the world, and not just the things that worry us. I wouldn't say at all. I think it's a bit of exaggeration to say that Israel there is depicted as on the verge of the second Holocaust. So I just want to have that be on the record. I would like to ask you regarding the socioeconomic issues that you pinpointed, which I think I agree with you, are very real. And one of them is the divide between the very wealthy and the very poor, and perhaps shrinking middle class. Do you feel the same thing in the United States? And I was wondering about your opinion here about in Israel, and what you think can be done or should be done to help remedy the situation.
Okay, so
I'll tell you. I think that the biggest problem for Israeli middle class today, and as in many other countries in the world, the middle class is that's the people who make pay tax. I mean, in Israel, okay, those are usually the people who pay taxes, go to the army, go to do their reserve service, and they're holding the economy basically. And I think that the biggest problem is that those people feel disenfranchised in a way, or if not disenfranchised, they feel that they are not getting from the government what they deserve in terms of social services and health, education. It's very. I think that it's very much the same in many other countries, and I think that the biggest problem is that more and more ministers, more and more politicians are much more aware of this, trying to promote legislation and to change it. But at the end of the day, I think that the big issues, okay, the big issues in Israel's economy, the centralization, and again the relations between the government and the citizens regarding what the government feels that its duty to do. Okay, I think that on those big issues, the government. When I say the government, at the end of the day in Israel, although it's a coalition system and a parliamentary system, the prime minister has almost presidential powers here. It's not, it's not in law, but that's the reality. Okay, and when the prime minister wants to do something, usually it's not. I don't know if it happens because we have here some sort of problem of delivering, but the main problem is that I think that the prime minister basically doesn't think that the changes that are needed are that dramatic and fundamental. And this is why basically what's happened, that on small stuff you see changes, but not on the big issues. I'll give you an example on housing. Okay, the main issue in the 2011 social economic protest was housing costs. Okay, and the prime minister said a few times that he will deal with it personally, and then after he did not deal with it, he would say, "Oh, now before the elections of 2013, he said, "Oh, now I'm going to deal with it personally," and then still nothing happened, and housing costs just went up. And then again, he said before the last elections, "Yes, I know I didn't do enough. I'm going to do more in my next term." And this issue, which is again, I think the number one issue that concerns Israelis today, housing costs. How would a young couple buy an apartment? Okay, this issue is ongoing. You don't see much progress.
Let me just say one thing about that. I think, about Barak mentioned how the socioeconomic things are what's foremost on people's mind. But there's a great saying that says that Israel's a wonderful country. It's a wonderful country. It's divided into thirds. Right? A third works, a third does the army, and a third pays taxes. What's the problem? It's the same third. Right? What happened is in 2013, for the first time, you saw this third say, "We can't take it anymore. Something has to change. We can't carry everybody anymore." They went to the polls, and probably for the first time in the country's history, they voted on socio-economic issues. What happened? Then, in this last election, again, because of the security issues, and because Netanyahu put the security issues out front, that drowned out all the other socioeconomic issues. The Israelis, I mean, we're a wonderful people. I think we're both hyperbolic, right? Everything we take to the extreme, and we also complain a lot, and there's a lot to complain about. Things will change when, like in 2013, people said, I can't take it anymore, and this is the issue I'm going to vote on. But the reason that doesn't happen, and this goes to back what I said in my introductory remarks, is because of the security component, because of the insecurity that the people feel, not on a national basis. I agree with Barak. Our situation is pretty good. We're pretty strong nationally. But individually, when you walk around the street and you look around your shoulder, right, that has an impact on you. And that's, I think, coloring the whole debate.
Mayor Habib from France.
Hello Barak, hello her. Two small questions. First of all, I listen to your analysis concerning the situation on the strength of Israel today. I quite agree with you, but you don't see that there is another winner today, which is, we already spoke with the former guys here, sorry. Est-ce que ça marche? Okay. The big winner today, it's maybe also Iran. Why? Iran now have an agreement. As I mentioned now, the president is going to be in Paris in few days, in 1 month. He is going to earn billions of dollars if they can develop their arm as they want. And Assad is here for many years. He's not already. He's going to leave. And it's maybe a question of war. Don't you think that it's a very big question of worrying concerning Israel? That's the first point, to be short. The second war, you speak always on it's a point of Haaretz, occupation, and so on. Maybe you don't think that after what happened today, it's time to think that all the borders are existing for the Accord Sykes-Picot in 1916. Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Israel, France, and Great Britain share that era. Maybe today we have to understand that we have a war not only of territory but also of religion. And mainly it's a war of religion between Sunnis and Shiite. And maybe to think this, or to change this case to say always that it's a question of territory, withdraw or no withdraw, it's false. And first of all, to solve that question of religion war, which kill not only now in Israel, but even in my country, in Paris, in all Europe. And I'm very worried, because what happened today, we have some right in France, which are arriving to almost 30%, and they are going to make more than 40, the next presidential. Is worry for a Jew, it's always worry that extreme right, and also extreme left are strong. And if we don't give the right answer to the right question, and to ask ourselves, maybe we are false in our analysis, what to think about those points. Thank you.
First about the question. First question about Iran. And I'll give you. I know it's not many people would agree, but that's my analysis of the situation with Iran. I don't think that Iran is winning at all. Okay, let's look at what happened in the last 2-3 years with Iran. Okay, it had a nuclear program that was unlimited. Okay, it got itself into a pretty strong sanction regime and accepted limitations on its nuclear program. Did it accept? Is the nuclear deal perfect? No. Is it good? No. But are we now in a better situation than we were a year ago? I think we are, regarding the nuclear program. That's one. Second, people say, oh, look, the Iranians are in control of 4 capitals in the region, okay? In Yemen, in Iraq, obviously in Beirut, and in Damascus, okay? And obviously in Tehran. Okay, so 5 capitals. And I say, no, they're not. Because what happened to the Iranians is, we have a saying in Hebrew, marbe nechassim, marbe deagot, okay, more fortune, more worries, okay? And the Iranians, I think, are in a situation of overreach. Okay, look at what's going on in Syria. Are they having any success in Syria? I don't think so. They're losing people, they're putting a lot of money into preserving Assad there, but they're not gaining any ground, they're not getting any progress, okay? Are they in a better situation in Lebanon? Their proxy Hezbollah is not. Okay, if their proxy Hezbollah is in a worse situation in Lebanon, they are in a worse situation in Lebanon. Are they in a better situation in Yemen? They got themselves into. I mean, they managed to do the impossible. Okay, to get the Sunni Arabs to get up their asses and finally do something. Okay, which is a very hard thing. They're the first country that managed to get the Saudis to actually use the thousands of bombs and fighter jets that they're bought from France and from the US and from all over the place. Okay, and they got the UAE to fight. They got the whole Sunni world to fight, to go out and fight. It's a first. Okay, and they got this. And for the Iranians, Yemen is also a sort of Vietnam for them. And in Iraq, at the end of the day, when the Iraqi government wanted help, it didn't go to the Iranians, it went to the US. So I'm not saying the situation is perfect, I'm just saying the Iranians are not in this huge victory and they're not on a roll. And let's look at what's going on in Tehran. Are we in a better situation in Iran than we were 5 years ago? I think so. It's not a Jeffersonian democracy. I guess it will never be. It's not the regime I want to have in Tehran. I'm not saying things are perfect. I'm saying that everything is relative, okay? And it's always what alternative you prefer. And usually it's picking between the bad alternative and the really, really bad alternative. And I just think that in Iran right now we only have the bad alternative, and it could have been much worse, and it was much worse. And I think that it's less bad. And you ask, why is Haaretz dealing with the occupation all the time? And by the way, I agree with you that the Sunni Shia struggle is the most important development in the Middle East in ages of historical dimensions. I agree with you that what's going on right now with ISIS and in Syria and Iraq and in Libya and Sinai and in Europe is part of it has the characteristics of a religious war. That's all true, but Haaretz deals with the occupation because it's the reality in Israel. Okay, it doesn't mean that this is the number one issue. That if we solve this, everything will be peachy and we'll be in paradise. No, but we think that for Israel, for Israelis, regardless of Syria and ISIS and all those issues in Iran, which are all important, but for Israelis, I think that the Palestinian issue for Israelis is an internal issue. Okay, it's not an external issue. So this is why it's important to solve it regardless of everything that is going on in the region. Okay? And by the way, I mean, look at what happened here in the last few months with Temple Mount. Okay? This is, the ongoing conflict, national conflict is, we were and we are still on the brink of going from a national conflict to a religious conflict. Do we want to have ISIS here? I don't think so. And I think that it's an Israeli interest to, I'm not under the illusion that, if tomorrow Netanyahu will say, okay, you know what, I agree to the 1967 lines, I agree to the right of return, we'll have peace and harmony the next morning. No, okay? But I'm just saying that it's in the Israeli interest to start dealing with this issue, this almost 50-year occupation. Is anybody here in this room under the illusion that the current situation with the Palestinians serves the Israeli interest? I don't think so. I met a few people in this building that think so. Okay, some of them are on the very extreme right. Okay, that want to kick out the Palestinians from here or to stay in an apartheid state, and the others are on the very extreme left. Okay, they just want to change the character of this country and not to have it as a Jewish state. So all the people that are in the middle, I think, should have an interest to, if not solve it, because I don't think that it's ready to solve it tomorrow morning, but at least point to that direction, to move, to start moving to that direction. And unfortunately, we are in a stalemate for 6 years now, and I think that it's in our interest to change it.
You have the, sorry? And Mark Lowenstein from Belgium?
I totally agree with what you say now. And I think that occupation is not only a big issue for Israel, but it's also a big issue for the picture of Israel outside. Because I don't speak about the far left movement and boycott and BDS, etc. But I think the politician, a common politician, non-Jewish, even also Jewish in our countries, are, but I speak about the others because as Jewish, we try to make asbara, so to take the other side, to defend the interest of Israel, but they don't have any problem with the existence of Israel, but they have a problem with the occupation and all the issues, all the statements in our countries. I talk about Belgium, but I think it's the same in France or in other European countries. Have linked with the occupation. And if we solve, I know that it's very, very complicated, very complex, but if we are on the way and we show that we are trying to solve the problem of the occupation, it will also help to have a better picture of Israel in Europe.
Look, I think it's obvious that if this question will be solved, then Israel's situation in Europe would be better. But I think it's equally obvious that it's not only in our hands to solve it. There's also another side here. I'm not saying that we don't have to do what we have to do. We have to do what we have to do. But the other side also has to take steps. And I think that what I find kind of irritating in the European approach is there seems to be, at least publicly, quite a bit of demands on Israel to take their steps and not a similar demand on the Palestinians to take their steps. Now, people will say, well, that's because you're the stronger side and you've got all the cards in your hand. But I think if the Europeans perhaps would put the Palestinians' feet to the fire to the same degree that they do our feet to the fire, then that would be a positive thing, because I don't think it's only in our hands. And I think what the Palestinians are doing, I think they got this thing figured out pretty well. And they realize that Abbas doesn't want to negotiate with Netanyahu, and I can understand it. Why negotiate with Netanyahu? He knows what he will get from Netanyahu, right? He knows what he got from Olmert. He's not going to get more from Netanyahu than he's got from Olmert. So why sit down and negotiate? Why not go to the world and get the world to step in and impose a solution on Israel? And I think that's his tactic. I think it's a smart tactic from his perspective. I think it's a tactic that Israel has to find a way to deal with, but I think that's where he's at.
I just want to add a few things on that, and I agree with her because there's an urgent need for Europeans to put also pressure on the Palestinians, by the way, on issues that have nothing to do with the occupation, okay? Take human rights, for example, take corruption, for example, take rule of law, for example. All of those have nothing to do with the occupation, okay? And I have a lot of problems with the occupation, okay? But once you give the Palestinians a carte blanche about their governance, their bad governance, their corruption, and their lack of rule of law, you don't contribute to the two-state solution. You just contribute to an endless status quo. But I want to connect to what you said and to Europe, and I think that many people around the world, and I'm not talking about people who are anti-Israel, I'm talking about friends of Israel in the US, in Europe, in other places in the world, they totally get the issue of security. Okay? They totally get that Israelis are attacked, that there's terrorism. They get it. I think what they don't get is why. First, I think that they don't understand what the Israeli government, what's the vision, where do we want to go? Okay, I think that Secretary Kerry, for example, was right when he said that he doesn't think that the Israeli government knows where it wants to go in the, not in the short term, but strategically. And I think that those people look at what's going on and say, okay, we're going to support you on security, we're going to support you on fighting terrorism, but we just don't understand why, if you say that you want a two-state solution, you keep on moving people to the other side. How do you want us to believe that you want a two-state solution when there are still Israelis that are moving to live where, in the place that the Palestinian state should be formed? I mean, it's not that the Palestinian state is not going to be on the moon; it's going to be in the West Bank. And Israel, unfortunately, is still moving people either as a government policy or out of a non-policy of stopping it. It's still moving people to the other side. And I'll give you an example. The labeling, the decision on labeling. Okay, many people say, and I was just in the U.S. A few weeks ago, and I met some of some legislators, and they all say, no, labeling is BDS. Okay, it's BDS. We have to fight it. Okay, and by the way, labeling is a tragedy that we needed to get to that point. Okay, it was very clear that it's going to get there. We had a lot of points in time we could have influenced it. We didn't. Okay, we wouldn't say we, the government, it didn't, and now we got there, and it's a tragedy. But it's not BDS. Okay, like it or not, it's not BDS. And unfortunately, I saw the bill that passed in Congress, and it's a very sad situation when I think that many people in Congress, out of this feeling, especially Democrats, not especially Democrats, out of the feeling of the post-Iran deal atmosphere, okay, when things are so politicized in the U.S. and when Republicans were putting Democrats on this and portrayed Democrats that supported the Iran deal as anti-Israeli, then now Democrats are supporting the most ludicrous decisions, okay, in their attempt to try to portray themselves, to defend themselves, saying, no, I'm pro-Israel. Okay, and I met with I don't want to mention the name. Just 1 second, mate. I don't want to mention the name, but I met with a congresswoman last week, and I asked her, do you support settlements? And she said, no, I don't. Do you think that the settlements that Israel should keep on building them? He said, no. Do you think that some of them have to go in a peace agreement? He said, yes, I do. Do you think that settlements are legitimate? He said, no. And I said, so why do you support a Congress bill against labeling? And she said, no, because it's BDS, it's against Israel. And I said, oh, no, it's not.
Exactly the same thing. I'm very sorry, Barak. That was my question to Manuel Valls. By the way, you didn't put even one line. It's not information, because Jerusalem Post put a quarter of pages today. It was very important, because my question, that's true that it's not exactly for Europe exactly the same. Labeling is permitted, and BDS is not permitted. If tomorrow you have peace, peace is real peace. It means that it should be Palestinian workers with Jews together, or have factories in any side, or work together. If morally, it's exactly the same thing. Labeling on BDS are the same thing. And if you share, you give exactly the possibility on all Europe, on all the world, to make BDS.
Yeah, and
morally, it's exactly the same thing.
And let me say, as one of the Democrats who voted against the Iran bill, I broke with the president, broke with the party. I have to tell you, I disagree with you. I think that BDS, labeling is absolutely BDS. I think it's part of the same attempt to delegitimize Israel. It's part of the same attempt to cast aspersions on Israel's motives. And I think it's very, very cleverly done. It's nuanced in each way, but I just don't see a distinction between BDS and the boycott and everything else.
Congressman, do you see the settlements as part of Israel?
I think that the issue of the settlements it needs to be done between Israel and the Palestinians.
No, me too. I'm just
I
asking.
don't think
if you
the rest of the world,
if you see it
because
as
I,
part of Israel, because that's.
well,
a factual question.
it depends what you mean by settlements. You can't blanketly say settlements. There are settlements, if you want to use the word, on the other side of the what you-
settlement for you?
right. But then there are outposts that are just being put up. I think the outposts are not helpful at all. But I do think that there are places like Efrat that some people would call settlements. I wouldn't. And I think that you have to just be smart about it. But I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that labeling comes out of this sort of wonderful way of trying to put an end to the occupation. I think it's all part of the attempt to legitimize Israel. And I think we share that in both parties. The thing with the Iran deal, I mean, a lot of my colleagues voted for it, and they honestly feel that it helps it'll help to bring peace. It'll help to shut down Iran for 15 years. It'll help to, do the kinds of things that check Iran. I mean, that's a legitimate position. I happen to disagree with it because I think my main objection to the Iran deal is Iran's going to be awash in money. They're going to have so much money now. Hezbollah's not going to know what to do with all the money. And in years that Iran had no money, because we were sanctioning them and they didn't have their money, they still found their way to be the #1 state sponsor of terrorism. With no money, with a terrible economy, with a terrible currency, unemployment, their priority was terrorism. Could you imagine now with tens or hundreds of billions of dollars what they're going to do with it? So I just feel that, and the deal for me was that it wasn't really, in my way, preventing Iran from getting a bomb. It was just delaying it 15 years. I'm happy to delay it, but I don't think the price to pay to prop up that regime and to take away sanctions was worth the trade-off. I just don't. I respect my colleagues who thought otherwise. I mean, it's like any debate, people come down on one side or another, but I do think that all these things are just an attempt to delegitimize Israel, whether you call it a boycott, whether you call it BDS, whether labeling. I just think it's all part of the same game.
Unfortunately, we don't have very much time. We're very pressed for time. We need to go to lunch. It's been a very, very good discussion. Thank you very much, Herb, and thank you for Barak. Anyone who wants to continue the conversation can do so separately.